The snow had been falling for hours. It coated the streets like a thick, muffled silence that buried the usual sounds of the neighborhood. No barking dogs, no rumbling engines, just the soft crunch of icy flakes landing on rooftops. It was one of those afternoons where time seems to slow down. The kind where memories crawl out from the corners of your mind and sit with you like unwelcome guests. Inside his tiny cabin on the edge of town, Tom, a man in his late 50s, sat slouched in an old armchair with coffee that had gone cold hours ago. He didn't bother warming it. What was the point? The warmth he craved couldn't come from a microwave. It had been 9 months since his wife passed away. Some days, he still expected her to yell from the kitchen, asking where he'd misplaced the damn sugar again. The silence now was too perfect, too still. It felt like a punishment, the kind you don't remember deserving. The only sound in the house was the slow tick of the wooden clock above the fireplace. It had belonged to her grandmother, and for some reason, it was the only thing that still worked in this house where everything else felt broken. Tom had stopped expecting visitors. He had stopped expecting anything, really. So when the knock came at the door, 3 slow, hesitant taps, he thought he imagined it. No one knocked anymore. Not here. Not at this hour. Not in this weather. Another knock. A bit firmer. His heartbeat kicked up slightly. Was it a neighbor? An emergency? He shuffled to the door and opened it just a crack. And that's when his world shifted. There, standing in the snow, was a bear. But not just any bear. This one was thin, trembling, and behind her were 2 tiny cubs, barely able to stand, their legs wobbling like they hadn't walked in days. Their fur was matted with ice, their eyes sunken but pleading. Not aggressive, just lost, freezing, desperate. Tom froze. He knew better than to open the door wider. This wasn't just a wild animal, this was a wild decision. But then something strange happened. The bear didn't growl, didn't move forward. She just stood there, as if asking, not demanding, not threatening, just asking. His breath caught in his throat. What was this? A hallucination? A cruel dream? Or was this something else? He looked into the bear's eyes, dark, wet, human almost, and something stirred in him. Something old. Something buried. The clock ticked louder now, each second stretching. Would you open the door? Would anyone? He knew what he was risking, but he also knew what it meant to be cold, to be hungry, to be alone. He reached for the handle and opened it, but he had no idea that single act would unravel everything he thought he knew. The door creaked as it opened wider, letting in not just the cold, but something far more uncertain. Tom stood frozen for a second, his hand still on the knob, wondering if he had just made the worst decision of his life or the most human one. The mother bear hesitated too, as if even she couldn't believe what was happening. Then slowly, she nudged one of her cubs forward with her nose. The little creature stumbled over the threshold like a child taking its first steps. Tom stepped back instinctively, heart racing, every primal instinct inside him screaming. But the bear made no move to harm him. She waited. One by one, the cubs came in. Then, with an exhale that seemed to release the entire weight of her survival, the mother bear crossed the threshold. The warmth inside hit them immediately. The stove in the corner crackled softly. The smell of burning pine wood filled the air. Tom watched as steam began to rise from their damp fur, their tiny bodies quivering with relief. He reached behind him slowly, never turning his back, and tossed another log into the fire. Then, Just like that, they all stood in silence, 3 starving animals and a grieving man, as if unsure what came next. He had read stories about animals following scent trails to food. But this wasn't just survival. This was something deeper. He felt it. Tom carefully backed into the kitchen, his boots clunking softly on the wooden floor. He opened the fridge, pulled out a pack of raw chicken he had planned to cook days ago, but never did. It was likely on the verge of turning, but for them, it might as well have been gold. He placed it gently on a plate and slid it across the floor. The bear didn't move at first. She looked at him, then at the food. Then, without a sound, she stepped forward and nudged the chicken toward the cubs. She wasn't feeding herself. She was feeding them first. And that did something to Tom. It shattered him. He sat down on the floor, legs outstretched, watching these creatures eat like it was their last meal. And in that moment, something softened. The icy wall around his chest, the one that had grown taller with every lonely night and every unanswered memory, began to melt. He whispered into the quiet room, "I don't know what you're doing here, but thank you." It felt ridiculous. He was talking to a bear, but it didn't feel ridiculous, because for the first time in months, he wasn't alone. The cubs finished eating and curled up by the fire, their small bodies rising and falling in sync, like breathing blankets. The mother bear laid beside them, never once taking her eyes off Tom. There was no growling, no signs of aggression, just tiredness, trust, maybe even recognition. That night, he didn't sleep in his bed. He dragged his old sleeping bag into the living room and laid a few feet from them. The fire cast long shadows across the walls, flickering like ghosts of the past, but he didn't fear them tonight. Instead, he stared into the flames, listening to the soft, rhythmic breathing of beings who had, somehow, found their way to him. And he wondered, what if they needed him just as much as he needed them? The storm outside hadn't stopped. If anything, it was growing stronger. But inside that cabin, something fragile and beautiful had taken root. Something unspoken. It wasn't just warmth. It was presence. And as dawn began to peek over the horizon, painting the frost on the window with streaks of orange and gold, Tom knew whatever this was, it wasn't over. It was just beginning. But he still had no idea what kind of trials the days ahead would bring. After several days of living alongside the bear and her cubs, Tom began to realize that what had started as a unique, transformative experience was quickly turning into a real challenge. What initially seemed like a quiet coexistence with these unexpected housemates was now testing him in ways he hadn't anticipated. The mother bear, once calm and accepting, was becoming more on edge. Her eyes, once soft, now gleamed with suspicion, and Tom could feel the tension in the air every time he approached her. It was no longer the easy, peaceful presence it had been in the beginning. The cubs were growing rapidly, and their increasing energy only added to the mother's sense of alertness. She was more protective than ever, her instincts on high alert. Whenever one of the cubs ventured too close to Tom, he could sense the faint tremor in the mother's body, as if she was ready to spring into action at the slightest provocation, even if that provocation was someone she had come to tolerate. Tom knew that he had to be extremely careful. One wrong move could lead to disaster for both him and the animals. The cubs, though still small and curious, were becoming more unpredictable as they explored their environment. They would paw at the walls, climb onto furniture, and leave little trails of destruction in their wake. One particularly cold night, as Tom was preparing for bed, he heard an unusual sound. It was coming from the back door. He cautiously approached, trying to make as little noise as possible. As he reached the door, he was met with a low, muffled growl. The mother bear stood there, her cub right behind her. Something was wrong. Without hesitation, Tom stepped back, careful not to startle her. His eyes briefly locked with hers. There was something deep in her gaze, an unspoken understanding that Tom couldn't quite grasp. He didn't know if he was helping the bears or if, in some strange way, they were helping him. The air was thick with tension. Tom could feel it in his chest, the weight of the moment settling heavily on him. The crackling fire in the corner seemed to echo the intensity of the scene unfolding. But just as the situation reached its peak, the mother bear suddenly turned away and nudged her cub gently toward the trees. For a brief moment, everything was still. Tom stood frozen, unsure of what had just happened or what was yet to come. The following morning, the tension that had simmered the night before was unbearable. Tom woke to the early light filtering through his windows, but the house felt different charged, like the air before a storm. The calm, warm feeling he once had when waking up high. The presence of the bears was gone. Now there was a sharpness, a sense of danger in the quiet. Tom knew something had changed. The mother bear was acting erratically. She had been moving more restlessly than usual, pacing around the house and occasionally letting out low growls. Her eyes never left the door. The cubs, playful and innocent as ever, didn't seem to understand the shift. They continued their clumsy adventures around the house, but Tom couldn't ignore the mounting feeling in his chest. Something was about to happen. His intuition was proven right when, just after breakfast, there was a sudden, loud noise from outside. Someone had knocked at the door. The shock of the sound sent the mother bear into a frenzy. She launched herself toward the door with frightening speed, her body low to the ground, her ears flattened against her head. Tom's heart raced as he stood frozen, paralyzed by the sight of her in full protective mode. He knew he had mere seconds to act. He had no idea who was on the other side of that door, but the bears had clearly taken over the house as their own territory. The door, once an ordinary boundary, was now the most dangerous threshold in the world. And the bear, having given everything to defend her cubs, was prepared to fight anyone who dared to enter. Tom rushed to the door, his mind racing. The knock came again, louder this time. He was afraid. If he opened it, would the situation escalate? Could he possibly control the consequences? But if he didn't open the door, what would happen to the outside world? He couldn't keep hiding from it forever. With a shaky breath, Tom made his decision. He opened the door. The sight that greeted him took him completely by surprise. It wasn't an intruder. It wasn't even another human. It was a man from a nearby cabin, someone Tom had never met before. But it was his expression that shook Tom to his core. The man stood frozen in the doorway, his face pale and eyes wide with fear. He had seen the bears before, but never this close. The man had come to check on Tom, to make sure he was okay, but he had no idea just how much danger had been brewing in that house. Tom stepped back, his hands raised slightly, trying to signal calm. The man didn't seem to know whether to run or stay, but Tom knew there was no time for panic. He had to think quickly. The bear was inches away from them, and Tom could see the muscles in her body tightening as she prepared for something. Her eyes burned with a fierce protectiveness that radiated out from her, as though it were a living thing. The moment was frozen in time. Everything felt slow, as though the world had paused to wait for what would happen next. Tom knew that every second mattered. One wrong move and he could lose control of the situation completely. But just as he thought it was too late, the unexpected happened. The bear, no longer seeing the stranger as a threat, paused, taking a deep breath. The intensity in her eyes softened, and for A moment, everything calmed. Tom watched in awe, his heart still racing, as the bear slowly backed away, her cubs following in tow. There was a brief moment of silent connection between them, as though the bear was acknowledging his presence, knowing he had made the right decision. The man, still standing in shock, finally spoke. "I've never seen anything like that before," he said in a shaky voice. You handled that well," Tom nodded, though the relief that came over him was short-lived. The danger had passed, but the weight of his actions opening the door was something he would never forget. He closed the door behind the man, locking it gently, and turned to look at the bears. For the first time, he realized the true responsibility he had taken on. The bond with these creatures wasn't just about feeding or caring for them. It was about the decisions he made in every moment, even when they felt impossible. The days that followed were a strange blend of peace and profound realization. Tom had lived through a roller coaster of emotions: fear, uncertainty, awe, and ultimately, a sense of deep connection with the wild creatures who had entered his life. The bears were no longer just animals to him. They had become symbols of his transformation. They represented the unknown, the unpredictable, and most of all, the power of decision. In the quiet of his home, Tom had time to reflect on what had happened. He realized that the moment he opened that door, everything changed. It wasn't just about letting the bears into his life physically. It was about allowing them into his heart. The simple act of opening the door had opened him up to a world he had never expected to experience. A world that demanded courage, empathy, and a willingness to face fear head-on. As the weeks passed, Tom's bond with the mother bear and her cubs grew. The tension that once filled his home had dissolved, replaced with a gentle harmony that surprised him. It was as though they understood him in ways words could never convey. They were still wild animals, but they had found a place in Tom's life. He was no longer an outsider looking in. He was part of their world, and they were part of his. He began to see the world differently. In the past, he had always felt alone, disconnected from the people around him. But now, as he watched the bears care for each other, he realized that the connection he had longed for had always been there, just waiting to be discovered in the most unlikely of places. Tom thought about the man who had knocked on his door that day. He never saw him again, but the memory of that encounter stayed with him. The fear and uncertainty in the man's eyes reminded Tom of just how fragile life could be, how quickly things could shift, and how much we rely on our choices in moments of crisis. Looking out the window one morning, watching the cubs play in the yard, Tom smiled. He had made it through the storm, and now he was starting to see the beauty in the aftermath. The bears were still with him, still part of his daily routine, but now he was no longer afraid. He had learned to embrace the unknown, to trust in his own decisions, and to find peace in the chaos. In that moment, Tom understood that sometimes the hardest decisions we make, those that scare us the most, are the ones that lead us to the greatest transformations. The act of opening that door had not only changed the course of his life, but had given him a new perspective on fear, courage, and love. As he stood there, watching the sun rise over the hills, Tom thought about all the moments in life when we stand at the threshold of change. It's always a choice: stay in our comfort zones or take the leap into the unknown. But as Tom had learned, sometimes the unknown is where we find ourselves. The door was still open, not just to the bears, but to everything that awaited him on the other side of fear. And for the first time in a long time, Tom felt ready to walk through it, knowing that whatever came next, he was no longer afraid. Tom's story shows us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to face it. If this story inspired you, hit the like button now to show your support for anyone brave enough to step into the unknown. Don't forget to subscribe and join our family of dreamers, where stories like this remind us that the impossible is always within reach. Share this with someone who needs a little hope today. Have you ever had to make a tough decision that changed your life? What did you learn from it? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's continue to grow together.